The air inside tasted of damp earth, tomato vines, and life. Outside, the world was a thing of white and grey, a sculpture of ice where nothing moved. Elias Thorne ran a calloused thumb over the waxy skin of a green pepper, the colour a defiant jewel against the frozen landscape visible through the glass panes. The temperature inside his creation hovered at a steady 60 degrees, while beyond the double-paned walls it was 40 below zero and falling. The wind, a razor from the north, shrieked against the structure, but inside the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft nicker of his horse, Copper, from the connected stable. This was the 3rd month of the Great Freeze. In the town of Prospect Creek, 2 miles down the valley, they were eating boiled leather and hope. Thorne was eating fresh salad. 6 months earlier, the laughter had been the loudest sound in the land agent's office. Elias Thorne stood before a desk cluttered with survey maps and property deeds, a hand-drawn schematic laid out flat between him and Mayor Thompson. The mayor, a man whose girth spoke of prosperity and whose face was permanently flushed with self-importance, tapped a thick finger on the drawing. "Let me be certain I understand you, Thorne," he said, a wheezing chuckle already building in his chest. "You intend to build a log cabin, standard enough, but then you intend to build a glass house, completely around it." "A greenhouse, Mayor," Thorne corrected him quietly. His voice was low and carried the rasp of a man who used it sparingly. "An envelope structure. The cabin becomes the insulated core. The greenhouse becomes the buffer zone. I will use the Earth's thermal mass to regulate the temperature." Thompson glanced at the sheriff, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. A smirk played on the lawman's lips. "A glass house, in a valley known for hailstones the size of a man's fist and snow loads that can crush a barn flat." "The glass will be angled at 60 degrees, Thorne explained, his patience a solid, unmovable thing. "It's the optimal angle for shedding snow and deflecting hail. The frame will be reinforced timber, anchored to a 2-foot-thick stone foundation that doubles as a heatsink." He pointed to a cross-section on his drawing. "I'll run pipes 4 feet under the frost line, geothermal circulation. The ground temperature down there is a constant 50 degrees. It will keep the inner space from ever freezing." The mayor leaned back, the chair groaning in protest. "Thorne, you were a good surveyor for the railroad, they say. Mapped the whole Black Spur Pass. But this is madness. People build thick walls and small windows for a reason, to keep the winter out. You're inviting it in for supper." "I'm capturing the sun," Thorne stated simply. "Even on the coldest, brightest day, the sun provides energy. The glass traps it, the stone holds it, and the inner cabin stays warm. I can grow food, all winter." That was what broke them. The laughter erupted, a loud, belittling wave of sound that filled the small office. The sheriff slapped his knee. Mayor Thompson wiped a tear from his eye. Grow food in a Prospect Creek winter. The man was not just eccentric, he was a certified lunatic. "Son, the only thing you'll be growing in that glass coffin of yours is icicles," the sheriff snorted. Thorne didn't flinch. He had seen winters in the high passes that would make a polar bear weep. He had watched the sun glinting off snowfields and felt its phantom warmth, even as the air froze the moisture in his lungs. He had studied the ancient cliff dwellings of the Anasazi, built into south-facing rock to absorb the winter sun. He understood energy, heat, and the unforgiving calculus of survival. They saw glass and folly. He saw a solution. He rolled up his schematic, the crisp sound of the paper, a final, sharp retort in the room, still echoing with their mirth. "I've filed the plans. The plot is mine. I'll require no assistance." "Assistance is the last thing you'll get," Mayor Thompson managed, still catching his breath. "But you'll have the town's entertainment for the summer, I'll give you that. We'll all be watching Thorne's Folly go up." Elias Thorne gave a curt nod, turned, and walked out of the office. The laughter followed him down the hall and out into the dusty street. He didn't look back. He had work to do. The earth didn't mock, the stone didn't laugh. And Winter, he knew, would not be telling any jokes. The work began the next day. He walked the perimeter of his plot, a small acreage on a gentle, south-facing slope at the valley's edge. He had chosen it with meticulous care. It received the first light of dawn and held the last rays of dusk. A small creek, fed by a high mountain spring, ran along its western border. He had Copper, his steady buckskin horse, pulling a slip scraper, and together they began to excavate the foundation. It was not merely a trench. He dug down a full 4 feet across an area 50 feet long and 30 feet wide. The townsfolk who rode by on their way to the high pastures would stop and watch, shaking their heads. "Digging his own grave," one of them muttered, loud enough for Thorne to hear. He just kept digging. The soil was a mix of rich loam and rock. He separated them, piling the loam for later use inside the greenhouse and stacking the stones. Every stone was a gift. Every stone would hold the sun. Once the excavation was complete, the real work began. He laid the foundation, a dry stack wall of the stones he'd pulled from the earth. He was not a mason, but he understood physics. He chose flat, heavy stones for the base, fitting them together like a vast, irregular puzzle. He used no mortar. He didn't need it. The weight of the wall and the precise interlocking of the stones would be its strength. It rose slowly, a foot a day, thick and solid. Within this foundation, he laid a network of clay drainage pipes, not for water, but for air. These were his geothermal vents. One end of the network would open to the cool, shaded northern side of the structure, while the other would vent up into the southern, sun-drenched interior. The simple principle of convection, of hot air rising, would create a slow, constant circulation, drawing the stable 50-degree air from deep within the earth up into the greenhouse, a passive, silent engine against the killing cold of winter. Next came the frame. He felled his own timber from the thick stands of lodgepole pine on the back of his property. He chose his trees with a surveyor's eye, straight, tall, and free of disease. He and Copper dragged the logs to the site, and the air filled with the scent of pine sap and the rhythmic rasp of his crosscut saw. He squared the logs into massive beams, notching them with an axe and adze, his movements economical and precise. The frame was a modified A-frame, but with a steep 60-degree pitch on the south-facing side and a shorter, more robust pitch on the north. This was the skeleton that would hold the glass and bear the weight of the snow. The townsfolk saw a bizarre, lopsided chapel rising from the earth, and their jokes took on a new, religious fervour. They called him the Reverend Thorne, preaching a sermon of foolishness. Inside this massive outer frame, he began construction of the cabin itself. It was small, just a single room, 16 by 20 feet. He built it with the same pine logs, but he chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud, sand, and dried moss that would set as hard as cement. He built a great stone fireplace and chimney against the north wall of the cabin, a massive monolith of rock that passed through the cabin roof and would extend up through the greenhouse roof. This chimney was the core of his system. It was not just for venting smoke. The stone would absorb the heat from his fires, becoming a radiant thermal battery, slowly releasing warmth into the cabin. But its secondary and more ingenious function was how it interacted with the larger greenhouse. The radiant heat from the chimney's exterior surface would warm the air in the greenhouse, contributing to the overall stability of the internal climate. The most difficult part was the glass. Glass was expensive, a luxury shipped by wagon over treacherous mountain passes. He had no money for new panes. But he had knowledge. He knew the history of this valley. He knew about the old Majestic, a paddle steamer that had sunk in Miller's Eddy a decade ago, a failed attempt to prove the river was navigable. He spent a week diving in the cold, murky water, using a system of levers and ropes. He salvaged the great windows from the steamer's ballroom, thick, heavy panes of glass designed to withstand river debris. He and Copper hauled them back to his land, one precious pane at a time. He built custom frames for each pane and began the slow, painstaking process of glazing the south-facing roof. He sealed each pane with pine pitch and linseed oil putty, a foul-smelling but remarkably effective sealant that would remain flexible in the cold. The northern roof he covered with sod, cutting it in thick, heavy mats from the meadow. This living roof would provide immense insulation and, come spring, would be covered in wildflowers. Finally, he built a small, insulated stable for Copper into the northwest corner of the structure, accessible from both inside and out. The horse's own body heat, he calculated, would contribute a not insignificant amount of warmth to the overall system. He dug a shallow well inside the greenhouse, ensuring a water source that would never freeze. He moved the rich loam he had saved from the excavation into raised beds that ran the length of the southern wall. The structure was complete. It was late August. The first chill of autumn was in the air. From the outside, it was an absurdity, a monstrous, lopsided structure of glass, logs, and living earth, looking like it had grown out of the hillside by accident. Thorne's Folly. The name had stuck. But from the inside, it was a cathedral of light. The sun poured through the angled glass, and the air was already warmer, holding a pleasant, earthy smell. Thorne stood in the center of it all, his cabin a small, secure house within a house, his garden beds waiting, his water source clear and cold. He felt no triumph, only readiness. His trips to town became exercises in stoicism as he bought seeds, salt, and other provisions he could not make himself. He endured the whispers and poorly veiled smirks. "Buying seeds, Thorne?" the general store owner asked, a grin twitching at his lips. "Planning on a bit of ice fishing in that glass pond of yours?" Thorne simply paid for his goods and left. He saw the women of the town, canning and preserving, their faces tight with the annual anxiety of putting up enough food for the winter. He saw the men reinforcing their barns and stacking cords of firewood higher than their roofs. They were preparing for winter the way it had always been done. They were preparing for a normal winter. Thorne knew, in his bones, that this winter would be anything but normal. He saw the signs. The squirrels were frantic, their caches larger and more numerous than he had ever seen. The geese had flown south a full month early. He saw bears, thin and desperate, foraging for roots and grubs far later in the season than they should have. He watched the sky. The sunsets were a strange, pale yellow, the light thin and watery. The air had a brittle quality, a deep, resonant stillness that felt like a held breath. One evening in late October, he stood outside his structure as dusk fell. The temperature was dropping fast, a sudden, shocking cold that sank into his bones. Copper, in his paddock, was restless, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Thorne looked up at the sky. There was no moon, only a hard, brilliant spray of stars. They did not twinkle. They glittered like chips of ice. He knew this sky. He had seen it once before, in the high passes, the night before a storm that had frozen 2 locomotives to the tracks and killed a dozen men. He put a hand on Copper's warm neck. "Time to go inside, old friend," he murmured. He led the horse into the stable, bolted the outer door, then walked from the stable into the relative warmth of the greenhouse. He sealed the inner door, and the world of the coming cold was shut away. That night, the first snow fell. It did not stop for 3 days. When the snow finally ceased, the world was buried. The valley was a sea of white, drifts piled 10 feet high against barns and houses. But it was not the snow that was the enemy. It was the cold that followed. A deep, relentless, penetrating cold, the likes of which the valley had not seen in 100 years. The sun became a pale, distant disk in the sky, offering light, but no warmth. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there. Then it fell to 30, then 40. Inside Thorne's folly, a quiet miracle was unfolding. During the few hours of daylight, the weak sun passed through the angled glass. It was enough. The temperature inside the greenhouse would rise to 65, sometimes 70 degrees. The thick stone foundation and the north wall of the cabin drank in this meager warmth. At night, as the temperature outside plunged, the stones would slowly radiate their stored heat, keeping the ambient temperature of the greenhouse from dropping below 50. Inside his small cabin, a modest fire in the great stone hearth kept the room a comfortable 70 degrees. He had planted his seeds in September. Now, in the heart of the deepest freeze in living memory, his garden was thriving. Rows of kale, spinach, and chard stood green and vibrant. Hardy root vegetables, carrots, beets, and turnips, were swelling in the rich, dark earth. Tomato vines, heavy with fruit, climbed trellises against the warm stone of the cabin's outer wall. He had fresh food. He had warmth. He had water from his unfrozen well. He and Copper were safe. In Prospect Creek, the ordeal began. The initial snow was a hardship, but the cold was a siege. Firewood, stacked for a normal winter, was being consumed at a terrifying rate. The snow was so deep and the cold so severe that sending out parties for more wood was a life-threatening endeavor. Houses with thin walls and poorly insulated roofs became iceboxes. The town's preserved food stores began to dwindle. Game had vanished, either frozen in their burrows or fled to warmer climes. The first to die was an old prospector who lived alone on the edge of town. They found him frozen in his chair, the fire in his hearth long dead. Then the sickness came, a racking cough that settled deep in the lungs, flourishing in the cold, crowded cabins. The doctor's supply of medicine ran low. People grew weak from hunger and cold, their bodies unable to fight off the illness. The town became a place of shadows, of huddled figures and fearful eyes. The laughter was gone, replaced by a grim, quiet desperation. By January, the town was starving. The mayor, Thompson, had lost 30 pounds. His face, once florid and full, was now gaunt and grey. He had organized a rationing system, but there was little left to ration. One evening, his wife collapsed from hunger. The doctor told him plainly that without real food, not just dried beans and flour, she would not last the week. That night, huddled by a dying fire, the sheriff looked at the mayor. "There's Thorne," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No one's seen him. He hasn't come to town since the first snow." "He's dead," Thompson said flatly, frozen solid in that glass coffin of his. "He was a fool." "Maybe," the sheriff countered, "but his place is only 2 miles. If there's a chance he has a side of bacon, a sack of potatoes, we have to try. We can't just sit here and die. The next morning, the mayor and the sheriff, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, set out for Thorne's property. The journey was a brutal ordeal. The snow was packed hard as slate, the wind a physical force that stole their breath and burned their exposed skin. It took them 3 hours to cover the 2 miles. When they finally crested the last rise and looked down at Thorne's Folly, they stopped in stunned silence. The structure was still there. The north roof was a thick white blanket of snow, a perfect insulator. But the south-facing glass roof was completely clear. The 60-degree angle had done its job, shedding the immense snowfall. And through that glass, in the pale winter light, they saw something that defied all logic. Something that made their starved minds reel. They saw the color green. They stumbled down the slope, their legs weak, and hammered on the thick outer door. For a long moment, there was no answer. They hammered again, shouting Thorne's name, their voices thin and lost in the vast, frozen silence. Finally, they heard the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door opened a few inches. Elias Thorne stood there. He was not gaunt. He was not grey. He looked healthy, strong. He regarded them with his calm, unreadable eyes. The 2 men stared past him into the space beyond. The air that washed over them was not the killing cold of the outside world. It was warm. It was humid. It smelled of living plants and damp earth. They could see the rows of green vegetables, impossibly alive. They could see tomatoes, red on the vine. It was a vision of a lost world, a paradise in the middle of a frozen hell. "Thorne," the mayor croaked, his voice breaking. "My God, you're alive." "I am," Thorne said. "And the food, is it real?" the sheriff whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Thorne didn't answer. He simply opened the door wider. "Come in, before you freeze." They staggered inside, and the warmth enveloped them like a blanket. They pulled off their frozen mittens, their fingers aching as feeling returned. They walked, dumbfounded, through the garden. The mayor reached out a trembling hand and touched a kale leaf. It was real. It was alive. He looked at Thorne, his face a mask of awe and shame. We laughed at you," Thompson stammered. "We called you a fool. We called this place a folly." Thorne was harvesting vegetables, his movements unhurried. He placed kale and carrots into a wooden crate. "The winter came," he said, as if that explained everything. And to him, it did. "My wife is sick, Thorne," the mayor said, his pride stripped away, his voice raw with desperation. "The town, we're starving. We were wrong. I was wrong. Can you help us?" For the first time, a flicker of something moved in Thorne's eyes. It was not pity. It was not triumph. It was the simple, profound weight of understanding. He had built this place not for glory, not for vindication, but for survival. Now, survival meant more than just his own. He looked at the 2 broken men, representatives of the entire town that had mocked him. He hefted the crate of vegetables. "Hitch my horse to the sled," he said. "I'll need help carrying this." That day, Thorne's Folly became Thorne's Ark. Elias led Copper, pulling a sled piled high with fresh vegetables, back to Prospect Creek. The sight of him arriving, a healthy man with a healthy horse and a sled full of impossible green food, was like a scene from a dream. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand apologies. He simply unloaded the food at the mayor's house and explained how to prepare it for the sickest residents. He made the trip every 3 days. He brought food, and with it, he brought a quiet, unshakable competence that was more valuable than any sermon. He showed them how to insulate their homes better, how to bank their fires to conserve heat, how to use the sun's reflection off the snow to warm the south-facing rooms of their houses. He taught them the principles he had used, the simple, observable laws of nature they had chosen to ignore. They listened. They learned. The town of Prospect Creek, humbled and starving, slowly began to recover. The fresh food broke the fever of the sickness. The warmth from their more efficient fires held the cold at bay. They survived. They survived because the man they had called a fool had refused to be one. When the Great Freeze finally broke in late April, the valley was a scene of devastation. Half the livestock had perished. The winter wheat crop was a total loss. But the people were alive. On the first warm day of spring, Mayor Thompson and a delegation of townspeople walked out to Thorne's property. They found him tilling his outdoor soil, preparing for a summer crop. Thompson stood before him, hat in hand. "Thorne," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words to say what we owe you. We ask for your forgiveness. And we ask for your help." He gestured back toward the valley. "We need to rebuild, but we need to build smarter. We need you to teach us." Elias Thorne looked at the faces of the people who had ridiculed him. He saw no mockery in their eyes now. He saw respect. He saw a hard-won wisdom. He stuck his shovel into the soil and leaned on the handle. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." In the years that followed, the architecture of Prospect Creek changed. New homes were built with south-facing windows and thick, insulated north walls. Small, glassed-in sunrooms became a common feature, used for starting spring seedlings and growing winter greens. They called them Thorne Gardens. His folly became the template for survival in a harsh and unpredictable land. Elias Thorne never became the mayor. He never sought a position of authority. He remained on his land, a quiet, watchful presence. He shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, teaching them the language of the sun, the wind, and the earth. He lived a long life, sustained by the food from his impossible garden and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had listened to a deeper wisdom. Long after he was gone, the great glass structure still stood on the south-facing slope. It became a landmark, a legend passed down through generations. Travelers would be told the story of the Great Freeze and the mad surveyor who built a glass house around his cabin. They were told how he grew vegetables in the dead of winter while a town starved, and how his folly became their salvation. The story always ended the same way. It served as a reminder that what looks like madness to the crowd is sometimes just foresight, standing alone. And that true strength is not in withstanding the storm, but in understanding how to bend the light of a distant sun to your will, creating a small, defiant pocket of life in the heart of a frozen, unforgiving world. The earth held. The arch held. The wisdom held.